Welcome to the Blue Hour. I am Farah Guerrero. You are here. I'd like to acknowledge with the Musqueam people. We are broadcasting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And we are CITR 101.9 FM, and this is an important day for me because I'm speaking with someone who is going to ground this land acknowledgement even more. So to begin with, long before museums and universities and even radio like today, these lands were places of learning, storytelling, artistic expression, and careful listening. And so it is an honor and privilege to gather here today in that same spirit of listening. And so visitors to what we have in the Musqueam people, I've learned, consider this their museum as well. It's the Museum of Anthropology. It's here on the University of British Columbia campus. And the MOA, as it's called, has welcomed works that affirm this place as living Musqueam territory. Among them are works by some very renowned artists, including Musqueam artist Susan Point, whose contemporary Coast Salish practice draws upon ancestral forms while speaking confidently to the present. And her work reminds us that Indigenous art is not simply preserved within museums. It continues to live and breathe and evolve and shape the communities from which it comes. And I think it's a fitting place to begin today's conversation. And so I'm very honored to have a guest today. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Kramer. She is a professor, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia, as well as a curator of the Pacific Northwest collections at MOA. For more than 2 decades, or potentially longer, she's worked alongside Indigenous artists, knowledge keepers, and communities, exploring how museums can become places of collaboration. And that is a key word we'll talk about today, as well as cultural renewal and shared authority. And through her research, teaching, and curatorial practice, she has helped reshape conversations about Northwest Coast Indigenous art, museum anthropology, and the evolving relationship between museums and Indigenous communities. And so it's wonderful to begin this conversation, but I want to devote a lot of this talk today to something that's very near and dear to Jennifer's heart. And this is a remarkable exhibition called Nuxalk Strong, Dancing Down the Eyelashes of the Sun. And this was at MOA, and it came down just earlier this year in January. But it was developed in collaboration between the Nuxalk Nation and the Museum of Anthropology, and the exhibition has been widely recognized for demonstrating how museums can become places where language, governance, artistic practice, and community leadership come together in powerful new ways. And this exhibition is wonderful because it's now bringing on some more ideas, and this is a forthcoming publication that Jennifer is working on, which explores the continuing impacts and legacies of this exhibition, and it's tentatively titled Relations and Returns, Reconnecting Nuxalk Treasures and Kin. So Jennifer, my apologies for that very long introduction, but welcome to the Blue Hour.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
So what I would like to do is a few things. Before we jump into the exhibition, which I'm really hoping we can spend most of our conversation today on, is to ground us a little bit in actually where you're coming from. So MOA, Museum of Anthropology, I told you earlier that it has a lot of childhood memories for me, but this is a very beautiful museum in many senses. You did your graduate work in Columbia University in New York, and there is someone that's near and dear to me by the name of Kenneth Frampton, who is a architect historian who really believed in the idea of grounding architecture with landscape. And Arthur Erickson, who has designed MOA, was certainly on the same side of that, which I think is a neat connection. Moa also went through a huge renovation, seismic upgrade. And so if you don't mind, just bringing us into Moa for a moment, talking about what it looks like, what we're going to see, what we can imagine. And then we will move towards a little bit up the coast, if you will.
Sure. It's a long history. The Museum of Anthropology was founded in the late 1940s by Harry Hawthorne, who was the first professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. And he came, lucky for us, with his wife, Audrey Hawthorne, who was the first curator at MOA. They were actually in the basement of what's now the I.K. Barber building here at UBC, but was then the main administration building and then a library. And we moved to that iconic structure by Erickson in 1976.
And there was a real need to preserve not only this incredible architecture, but also to ensure that the collection, as invaluable as it is in its terms of its cultural heritage and as well as its importance, needed to have an upgrade. And this is to do with our seismic world that we live in here.
Yes. I should say we had just sort of finally completed a very large renewal project called a Partnership of Peoples, a new infrastructure for collaborative research at MOA when I started in 2003 and through to 2010. And we were all ready to do new things when we were told that we got the funding to seismically upgrade the Great Hall. And what that meant was that from the curatorial perspective, all of the totem poles and monumental architecture and monuments that were there needed to be carefully pulled down and basically put to sleep, to rest horizontally with the permission of the rights holders who have ongoing rights. And it allowed us to work with our world communities, but mostly our Pacific Northwest, which is the peoples you see in the Great Hall when you enter in the ramp, go down to what we call the crossroads, to where the platforms are, and then to the Great Hall with the soaring glass. And so the curators worked with each individual monumental, you could call them artworks, you could call them belongings, because they had these ongoing connections to people with ongoing work to do. And we basically said, we're going to be taking these down in order to add what's known as base isolation to the museum space. I'm not an engineer, but I learned from speaking with engineers and architects that if we put in base isolation and redid the mounts in culturally respectful ways, that when the next big one hit, and we are very overdue on the Northwest coast for that, that the P waves and the S waves would shake sideways but not take down the building. They would just their energy would flow sideways. And so for that reason, that's why the Great Hall was closed to the public for 18 months while we did this work. But it was fortuitous because it allowed us to work with an Indigenous advisory committee on re-narrativizing, reinterpreting the entire entrance to what we now say is the Pacific Northwest Galleries. As well as physically protecting these treasures, these belongings. And we also, at the same time, before we closed the building, we put up an exhibit called Shake Up, Preserving What We Value, which was about not only preserving these physical treasures, but also all of this thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge that goes into making them. And these physical treasures are basically like legal representations. They're legal documents that attest to such long-standing relationships to the lands and the waters in this place.
And I will mention that base isolation was the first time that was ever used in any museum in Canada. So that's actually quite amazing. It is a new form of engineering that is coming into this country, but that's quite special. And it's wonderful that the funds were there, because at the end of the day, you want to protect what I love the word treasures. And we're going to talk about what's in your collection in different words. But let's just walk us down for a moment, because as you walk into this, what you end up in this sort of great hall is you are walking up the coast in some ways, right? You are going through the very diverse communities of this province, and looking at the beauty and what the Musqueam people like to call their belongings, right? That have been, as you say, that are very, very special to these communities, and you can experience in some ways that feeling of going up the coast, where you may end up as far as Haida Gwaii or maybe the Tlingit people, right? And it goes all the way through. So that is where we're going to go a little fast forward, because as you go up the coast in this province, you will get to a place called the Bella Coola River Valley, or Bella Coola lands. And this is really the crux of what the exhibition Nuxalk Strong is about. So before we even talk about the exhibition, I thought it would be lovely if you could give us a visual of, so now we're outside of Moa, and now we're onto the land where the Nuxalk people come from. And I will just quickly say that was the first time in history, am I right, that a Nuxalk exhibition of that kind was ever on display in the world?
Yes.
So that's very, very special. But let's go to Bella Coola for a moment.
Sure. If you haven't been to Bella Coola, it is an incredibly special place. Picture, it takes about, I like to say, maybe 350, 400 kilometers as the raven flies from Vancouver to Bella Coola proper, but you can't drive direct because there are the Coast Mountains in your way. So unless you are taking a plane there, it's going to be about 12 hours to get to the Bella Coola Valley. And you come in from the plateau, which is a very different area, and you descend down these switchbacks into a rainforest. And this rainforest has soaring 6,000-foot mountains covered with snow and glaciers, with the Bella Coola River running right through it. And it would take about an hour and a half, 2 hours to drive from the base of the switchbacks, which people call the hill, to where the inlet of the Pacific Ocean hits the community of Bella Coola. And it is a place filled with bald eagles and bears and salmon. And it's a place that the Nuxalk have lived in for, we know, 14,000 years. So before the Ice Age, before the ice retreated from what we now call British Columbia.
That was really beautiful, Jennifer. And so we can imagine this now. And now we're going to come onto this, this beautiful exhibition in our mind's eye, because we can't see it. It's now been tucked away. maybe it will move on somewhere else. You can tell me that. But Nuxalk Strong, is what it was called, which is a word, if I'm not mistaken, that was coming from a movement in the 90s. Is that right? That was amongst leaders and peoples in the community to really fight against, I guess, what was clear cutting at the time?
Yes. In the late 80s and the 1990s, the Nuxalk Nation was involved in protecting an area of their territory. Well, all areas of their territory, not just the Bella Coola Valley, were being logged, were being clear-cut logged. And so they ended up working with the Forest Action Network and Greenpeace eventually to protect their hereditary lands from clear-cut logging. And at that time, the cry was Nuxalk Strong. And so we redeployed that cry. And actually, it's interesting because it isn't just a political contemporary idea of First Nationhood, which really only came about for the Nuxalk in the 80s and 90s. But dancing down the eyelashes of the sun is actually the other side, which is when the Nuxalk came down from Nusmata, from above, from the heavens, following the eyelashes of the sun, which was the Creator, Akundam, in the guise of the sun, and landed on the mountaintops took off these cloaks, which we call those crests, so bear, raven, eagle, turned back into their human form and built their villages and put up their fish weirs, and that's what became their ancestral territory. And it's so retelling those mayusta, those origin stories, that brings us back to Nuxalk sovereignty on those lands and waters. So we had both. We had that political kind of contemporary energy that happened in the 1990s, and then all the way back to time immemorial.
Now, this exhibition, what makes it special, but what makes MOA special as well, and I think this is something that's really important. This is a continuation of the legacy of MOA, and it is something that might be termed academically as collaborative museology, but really it's the idea that this exhibition, like so many exhibitions at MOA, was in collaboration with the Nuxalk Nation, as well as a co-curator, a young man, as I've learned, named Clyde Talio, who is a director of culture, very important person of the Nuxalk people, one of the self-taught person of the language. And so tell me about this partnership that you've had, but also a relationship that you've had for some time.
Yes. When I first went to Bella Coola, Clyde was just a young man, and I actually didn't meet him. It wasn't until about 15 years later that I met Clyde for the first time, and his energy, his passion, he was trained to be a leader for his people, a speaker. So by speaker, it means the person that shares the laws and the protocols, the guidance from the chiefs and the matriarchs, and speaks at potlatches for the work. And so he's called upon to represent his nation in all different kinds of ways, from government to healthcare to tourists to, to youth who are going through initiations, to dancers who are learning Indigenous ceremony. And so I would never have done this exhibition without him. It wouldn't have been possible. But it really goes back to a basic human right, which is nothing about us without us. I mean, and it does go to British Columbia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. It goes back to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I mean, this is foundational. People have the right to present how they want to be identified to a public. You have the right to share what you want to share and to keep private what you want to keep private. So not only was Clyde the co-curator, we also, this is definitely, I've only heard of this happening one other time on the Northwest Coast. We had a Nuxalk artist, Anuchimana Jade Hanus, as a design intern doing the graphics with our own in-house graphic designer. And then all of my relationships, it really comes down to the people that I've known in Bella Coola, whether they're weavers, whether they're teachers, whether they're language speakers, whether they're elders or stadaldam, which are chiefs. So many people actually were involved in creating the labels and telling the stories of what's going on in Bella Coola today in Nuxalk Strong.
And so tell us how that kind of collaboration works. So we want to imagine how, and this is really kind of the crux, I think, of what may not be known to a lot of people, not only about what MOA has done for a long time and may take for granted because you've always had this embedded into part of your, how you show work. And it's also been something that has been transformative over time. So the more that you have these collaborations with Indigenous peoples, the more things can change, even physically in the museum. But this type of collaboration, give us a sense of what it actually looks like and how many years you would have been. I know that there was a lot of travels involved with you trying to get even hold of many, many things around the world that belong to the Nuxalk peoples. There was a lot of discovery. There was probably a lot of emotion. And so how long did that take? And how did it actually come together? And then, of course, what we have to talk about is how the exhibition was inaugurated and how, because that was very momentous for the community.
Yes,
I can imagine.
it was. It's really hard. People ask, well, how long did it take? And it's really hard to put a start date and an end date because I feel like the collaborations, the work have never ended and really began the minute I was allowed to spend my first year in Bella Coola, way before I met Centicula Clyde Talio. And one of the things that Clyde and I talk about a lot is that one project that we do perhaps starts based on a museum type of treasure, a raven rattle or a specific mask or a family-owned treasure, but then morphs into new and different things. So it's very hard to put, nice, neat guidelines because this is really about relationships and people. The exhibit becomes just one moment maybe that kind of freezes that relationship in time, even though we try to embed a lot of language and song in the Nuxalk language, as well as video and contemporary. We really mix the historical with the contemporary because, of course, we want to be showing that future-focused perspective. But Clyde and I guess when we first met, we started visiting museum collections together and have really gone across North America. We've been to the Field Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, obviously the Royal British Columbia Museum, the Royal Ontario Museum. I'm sure I'm missing ones. Oh, all the ones in Washington, D.C. So various grants, various...
You didn't go to the British Museum.
We haven't been to the British Museum together. I have been to the British Museum, the Cambridge Museum, and the Pitt Rivers to look at Nuxalk collections.
I was going to say, because they are there.
They are there, and they are also, we are now in the process of planning trips to Norway, Sweden, Germany, which is where Germany has a very early Nuxalk collection by Adrian Jakobsen. But these journeys are really interesting because it isn't just, people think, oh, what do museum curators do? They look at physical objects and they track, the materiality of that object, the provenance, how it got there. That's part of the story. But really it's about figuring out whose treasures these are, how they were, most of them were sold, not stolen per se, actually, right? There may be that feeling that there were forces against people to rid themselves of it. And there certainly were, like the anti-potlatch law. But most of these were sold, if under duress or not. And we can track back these lineages of which families they belong to. And this is active work that's happening in the nation now as families are re-engaging with what we call their nushlichta, their treasure boxes. And in those treasure boxes are the masks, the regalia, the blankets that tell that smayusta about how that individual family came up, down from above, and where they landed, giving them rights to resources, rights to live in the lands and waters, but also responsibilities to the lands and waters. So in a funny way, going to these museum collections, which sounds like it's about the past, it's about archives, it's about, researching academics, is really about plotting the future sovereign moves of families today as they're potlatching more, as they're bringing out more dance initiatives with their youth, about teaching their youth about their responsibilities in this place.
And maybe it is important to just give a sense for people to know what MOA has done. So one example is really beautiful because you have someone like Mungo Martin, who I once heard by someone at my local museum. He's the Michelangelo of Canada, and rightfully so, even got the name M in his name. But the idea of being very, very important carver to this country's history. But he was a big part of initially, if I'm not mistaken, bringing some of these treasures from the Kwakwaka'wakw people into MOA. And they were, as you say, there was this process of being sold, but he saw it as a wonderful place to be preserved into
A safe
antiquity,
place.
safe, and then certainly under the right conditions, because so many of these things, and I know that you don't like the word artifact, and museums are trying to get away from that word, but the idea being that they are precious, they need to be cared for, and museums, thankfully, according to their sort of category A statuses, that they may have, they can really keep the right temperatures and climate control. So Mungo Martin, I felt, at least in my understanding, saw that vision. That has been a long history of MOA. And so, but that doesn't mean that the peoples don't have access to these treasures. They do. And it's sometimes they come to you.
Yes.
Is that right? For study, for looking at, for whatever. So it's a real collaboration.
I call it a reunion when community members come to MOA to see their belongings and treasures. It's a very emotional, bittersweet moment. It's both such excitement because you're basically meeting the hands of your ancestors. You're meeting what your relatives created, and their life force is embodied, is in that. Or it might be your family's treasure, but you don't know who made it, but it has that long-standing ancestral connection to you. So there's this feeling, there's a lot of tears, often a lot of pride, a lot of learning from connecting with the incredible technologies of production that you find, whether it's weaving. I mean, people celebrate the carving on the Northwest Coast, and it is incredible. But one of the things that we've worked to put more front and center is weaving in both cedar bark, cedar root, and wool, because it takes an incredible amount of time to do that kind of exquisite work. And so MOA has really tried to be as accessible and as welcoming as possible, because we just figure we are the caretakers of these belongings. And yes, we have the museum class A, ability to keep the air a certain temperature. We have conservators on staff. But actually what MOA is doing more and more, and it's starting to happen around the museum world, is we're paying attention to the Indigenous owners' protocols about how to care for these belongings. Some of these belongings are not objects, they are ancestors. Some are imbued with sacred meaning and can only be seen or witnessed or danced by certain people at certain times. Others need to be fed. But what I would say about the Nuxalk in general is, many communities, even though we try to be as open and inviting, we have small grants to bring communities to us, we're trying more and more actually to bring these belongings home. And we don't use the language of a loan because that sounds so Western about ownership. It's a visit home. And the more we bring belongings home for ceremony and for replication and for just being near to them, the less we're finding that communities actually want the physical treasure. It's not that we're against sending the physical treasure home. They should go home if that's the work they need to do. But we're finding that people see that respect that we're giving to their stewardship and don't want the physical responsibility of the actual belonging.
Which we need to talk about the idea of, what could potentially be a museum in Bella Coola and how that would look. And I want to get there. But you mentioned weaving, and I think that's really, really important, because one thing that you had on in this exhibition, and I cannot pronounce it.
Yak Yank.
Yes, a robe. But so the a lot of weavers, say from the Tlingit Nation, are very, very, very skilled, very beautiful, what we call chilkat blankets. And I mentioned this with my interview with Curtis Collins from the Audain Museum last week. But this is a robe that is not as well known, and it's also because of when the sort of practice of weaving was severely interrupted as well. And so there is a revitalization of that amongst women weavers, but maybe you can speak to the actual...
Yes, absolutely. Nuxalk weaving is completely distinct and unique from the northern Chilkat or Raven's Tail, and also from the more southern Salish woven blankets. It's its own thing. And even in the 1990s, when I was learning about Nuxalk culture and being in the community, there were none of these blankets present being used by the community. They were using button blankets. But these were originally mountain goat wool woven blankets. And what's interesting is they were woven, but then they were embroidered with those crests, those smayusta, the stories about how Nuxalk came down from Nusmata. And so one of the exciting things that we had the opportunity to do in this exhibit, I mean, exhibits always have two functions when they're collaborative. There's the showing the public who you are about something they might not know anything about. And then it's about what can it do for the community, for the nation, to help them learn, do what they want to do. And so bringing back these Yaqyank and finding them in museum collections was very important to the Nuxalk. They had only just started working with a master Tsimshian weaver, Willie White, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago to bring back Nuxalk weaving. And William had been to all of these museums and seen Nuxalk weaving and blew his mind and just thought, we have to get this happening again in Bella Coola. And so we were able to bring, for example, a very special robe from a specific family, Staldontalio Hans, who was a chief whose son inherited this blanket maybe in the 40s or 50s. Actually, it might even have been a little bit earlier. And he made the difficult decision to put this Yaqyank, this robe, in a museum for safekeeping, kind of along the same lines that Mungo Martin, when he told people among the Kwakwaka'wakw to send their treasures to Moa for safekeeping. And it ended up at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. But as happens in families, when you inherit anything or when, histories get forgotten, people had forgotten what museum it went to and forgotten that choice had been made. So it had been disconnected. And we were able to borrow that Yaqyank to the exhibit. And it is incredibly beautiful, very powerful story. And one of the other things we did, I always wanted, it sort of came out of the exhibit, but we co-obtained a grant with the Nuxalk Nation from First Peoples Cultural Council to bring weavers together with historical Yaqyank that were in museum collections. So we had 2 at Moa, and this one we borrowed from the Glenbow for the exhibit. But then we also, the Royal British Columbia Museum brought 4 Yaqyank robes and aprons, and the Canadian Museum of History sent 2. So we brought them together for an intense, 3 days of study with, it's true, they are mostly female weavers in Bella Coola.
Yeah. Or we don't know. This is the other thing. Sometimes, even with carvers, I learned
there can be female carvers. There can be male weavers.
We don't know what was really lost in that, and sometimes we don't even know the names of these weavers, of course, right? But you mentioned study, because this is really important. When we think of a museum like MOA, what's special about it, I think, is that it's also an institution of learning, right? So you have, of course, the university. It is a university museum, so you have people that are well connected with all the different kinds of connections, right? Whether they're coming from, a department like yours or not, they could be coming from history as well, etc. And then you have people, like you say, of communities that come to do studies of these belongings, and that is really important because that and I would also go further. You even have the facilities to allow carvers to come in and sometimes work on site when they're working on something. I know a little bit of inside information about how some pieces may have started kind of come down from the north down to Moa, and then maybe, vague, and then maybe further on. But it is the idea that you have that space. So why do you think that's so important? I mean, do you feel in some ways that you're sometimes working in more of a community hub than a museum in its sort of traditional sense?
Absolutely. I mean, the time to come see MOA and the Great Hall for which we are known is when that space is filled with dancers, with weavers, having a contemporary fashion show, having a debate, bringing knowledge holders together. It's when it's alive, because I think people think of museums as places where objects are behind glass. And I really push back on that idea. Objects have functions and they need to be alive. And MOA tries to make spaces where people can be in relationship with their belongings. Sometimes the belongings go home for visits to be replicated. Actually, the Talio Hands blanket, the Glembo allowed us to keep it longer after the exhibit came down so that we can figure out a way to get it home for the memorial of the wife of Willie Hands, who had owned it. So there's all kinds of ways of activating this space. And it's absolutely future focused about thinking, and this is how we thought about it in New Hulk Strong as well. Clyde talked about the elders always talking about clearing the path for the success of those now and for those future yet unborn. So it was always about thinking about how to guarantee the ongoing wealth, but not wealth as in material, like dollars wealth, but wealth as in connection and knowledge to the land, to your past, but also to your future. And so the fact that MOA was able to work with New Hulk weavers to reconnect them to these treasures so that they could learn from the hands of their ancestors was truly exciting. There was a moment where each of the women put on one of those yak yank and danced and sang. And it was... They talked about having this spiritual, supernatural kind of time stopped. And they were able to both be connected to the past and get excited for what they were making, because they're making headbands, they're making aprons, they're making potlatch bags, they're going to be making robes, and these are going to be danced. And so it's that ongoing connection into the future. Okay, that was a long answer to your question.
No, but it's beautiful. It paints a picture of what this type of study looks like. Study also sounds like a lab.
Yeah, it sounds
but
passive.
It's not.
It's not.
People
it's
are coming
hands-on.
in and are engaged with the art in a very real and deep way. And that's, and protocol, that's a word that I remember way back when I studied Native Studies at Trent University. It's still very important because that dictates a lot of things that you do at MOA. And as you said, that may change even how things are sort of physically presented, right? And that's important. Again, collaboration. And this is, I think, this is an exciting time, I think, because we're seeing this, as you say, not just at MOA, but around the country. Indigenous peoples are a big part of exhibitions when, their art, their craft, their beautiful weaving textiles are on display, and they are telling the stories as much as the curators. So I think that is really, really special. And I certainly talked about that with Curtis last week from the Audain Museum. But I want to also, you mentioned something quite beautiful, because I didn't have the privilege of seeing this exhibition at MOA, but you said that it was actually designed in a way to capture the geography of the region. Can you kind of tell us what that looked like?
Yes. I was happy that the exhibition New Hulk Strong happened in what we call the O'Brien Gallery. This is an old space that was there when the museum opened in 1976. So it's a kind of long, skinny space that wraps around the back of where The Raven and the First Men is by Bill Reed that we all know. And so it kind of has this wiggly valley-like structure. And I thought, this is perfect. When people enter this space and the front, what we called the front, you were welcomed by this giant thunder being designed by and they're known as the Valley of Thunder. It's their own supernatural being that no other nation has. And the doors open and you walk in and you're welcomed by Chief Noel Pootlis Nuhim who's the chief of Kumkuts, where they all live now. And you're kind of hugged by the mountains, but instead you're hugged by the walls of the exhibit. And it's like you've paddled in from the Pacific, coming from another place. You've come into the inlet, into the estuary, and you're about to go up the Bella Coola River to Kumkuts, which is the traditional name of the village where Bella Coola is now. And we even the colors, the designs of the cases, both the MOA's 3D designer, Josh Docherty, and 2D graphic designer, Cody Rocco, who are incredible artists and designers. We were able to bring them to Bella Coola, hosted by Jade Hanus Anuhimana, this incredible artist. And she took them to the land, to the forest, to the petroglyphs, to the water, and showed them what this space looks like and feels like, and the colors and the people and the carvers. And then that ended up, we had curtains that replicated the way that kind of the clouds sit on the top of the mountains, and then when they blow away, suddenly the sun pierces down. And so we had this orb like the sun. And of course, as we know, the title is Dancing Down the Eyelashes of the Sun. And we had this beautiful drone video that was taken by a local community member of what it's like to sort of fly through the valley and see these snow-topped mountains with the Bella Coola River down below. So it really just, you're hugged by this place, and the place is so much about the messages about this being the home of the Nuxalk Nation.
And I have special memories of being in Bella Coola. As I told you, it's a really beautiful, beautiful place. It's hard to describe, but you've described that wonderfully well earlier, and even imagining that you can incorporate that through the exhibition, why that would be so important. Definitely, when we talk about Indigenous peoples, we cannot forget the land that influences their art, their identity, their cultural understanding of the world. It was only for me actually going physically to Haida Gwaii to understand some of the Haida artists that I love, and I recommend anyone doing that. It's basically no different than if you go to Rome and you want to know about Bernini. You understand when you're there. It's almost the same experience, right? And so this exhibition, I want to talk about what may come of it, because this is not just something that you wanted to just sort of pack away. You wanted to continue, and just by hearing the way you're speaking about it, I get a sense, at least, that this is something that is maybe just the beginning of a longer continuation with the peoples. And maybe it's time now to talk about what the Nuxalk people are planning in ways of, the big house. That's something you do talk about in one of your papers, and also as well as a possible museum that could exist on the Nuxalk territories, and as well what you have a working project where you'll be looking at potentially continuing this exhibition in a way that will, I would say, strengthen, if anything, those collaborations and that you have already.
Yeah. I mean, just to back up a little bit, it's absolutely true that the Nuxalk have been planning a big house. Clyde Talio, the Director of Language and Culture, has already created these guidelines for bringing back their rites of passage for young people, these secret society initiations. But really, that makes it sound very different than you or I. But the Nuxalk don't celebrate anything that anybody else, rites of passage when a young girl becomes a woman. Well, what does it mean when suddenly not only are you bringing back, giving this young lady a new name and teaching her what it means to be a young woman, but you also have gone to a museum, seen the traditional cedar bark regalia that these young women would have worn, and then brought it back for the first time. So it kind of is it's happening right now. They're bringing back things like akwakam, which is the recognizing of babies when they pass their first year, and holding them up in their family, in their institution, and these rites of passage for both young women and young men, and bringing back these secret society kusut dancing, the winter ceremonials. But I wanted to take a step back and say that Clyde Talio thinks very strategically about how he speaks about the relationship, not just with their belongings, but with museums. And he sees them as working towards that we can work together to support these future-focused goals of expressing Nuxalk sovereignty, of revitalizing Nuxalk culture, and not just for the Nuxalk, obviously, but where I saw Clyde as so different than many. Museums are colonial spaces. That's their history. Mm-hmm. But MOA and many, many other museums have been working at decolonizing these histories, indigenizing these histories. And Clyde was the first to say that MOA can be our ally in following through on what our elders who had this foresight to clear the path for future generations by talking with academics, ethnobotanists, linguists, ethnographers, recording our songs on wax cylinders so that when the nation was ready, when we had recovered from the 4 modern catastrophes of the smallpox epidemic, being put on reserves, Indian residential schools, and the anti-potlatch law, when we were ready, we would be able to reconnect. And so he's celebrating that foresight, but he's also sharing, this isn't a let's go back to the way the Nuxalk were 300 years ago. This is about thinking about how they're going to be ongoing now. We're all in this together, settlers and Indigenous people, and how we can work together towards common goals. And Centicula, Clyde Talio would say there's so much that settlers need to learn from Indigenous ways of being in relationship to the land. And one of the main values of that exhibit was something he called Nael Yanth. He'll laugh at my pronunciation, I'm sure, but it means reciprocal generosity. Mm-hmm. Another way of saying, like, paying it forward, thinking about generations beyond you, but that we're in this relationship together, and together we can, do better.
And this is it's a very good. That's a very good answer, because it's not about reinstating something that was lost, but maybe reinventing something. And the other thing, too, to think about in a community like Bella Coola, which the population is about 2,000 or so, do the community members want to put a lot of resources into a museum that could require, a lot of stuff that you take for granted at MOA to protect these very important pieces. So it is, I think it's a work in progress. And these are discussions that are all over the country, I would probably say. And this is part of what you mentioned earlier about truth and reconciliation. It's all part of this idea of trying to understand things. But absolutely, MOA and what I think is happening, and certainly with this exhibition, shows that there can be so many ways that can actually look like a way where even if people have to come down south for a bit to, or you to go up a little bit north, it can work both ways. And that seems to be the way of the future. The other thing I want to mention is just something, the importance, and this is if, any Nuxalk people are listening, someone like myself who spent a little bit of time in Bella Coola, very beautiful moments of my life in that gorgeous part of the world. When I see a mask that I see quite often up in Whistler, which is what they call the earthquake mask, it is from the Nuxalk people. It is to be honest, one of my favorite. It's carved in such a beautiful way that it's hard to even describe or compare it to some of the other carvers. And the colors, and this is from the 1800s, of course, and it is, I tell on my tours that that this is an understanding of seismology that these peoples had, that this is very scientific as well. It's not just related to myth here or cultural practice, but certainly seismology. And but I feel privileged to see that, and so there's an importance for the average museum goer in this country, and I should also say museums are visited by people from all over the world, that this work needs to be on display, and it's worth showing because it makes us connected to a place we may never imagine that we could go to. It makes us connected as human beings. And it's also, I would say, like the Michelangelo Mungo Martin thing, to say, well, these people who carve these things, who weave these textiles, should be shown on display because rightfully so. This is a skill set of beauty, that even when we talk about treasure, we can just say art. This is the creative art that only human beings, I think, really, not AI, human beings know how to do.
There's a Nuxalk word for that I learned from Clyde Tallio. It's anuquintnicum, and I think I actually pronounced that one right, which means inspirational creativity. And Clyde talks about, obviously you can apply it to learning from museum collections and the new artists doing all these new, whether it's carving for sale in a beautiful gallery, for someone's home, or whether it's making a mask to be danced at a potlatch. But he also talks about anuquintnicum for song composers and dancers and even the food preparers who are making your beautiful meal. It's all about the aesthetics, and that I like the way you put it, that humanity. It can't be done by an AI.
No, thankfully. And just very quickly, since we're almost out of time, I just want to do a little plug for Nuxalk Radio, because this is actually embedded in some of your research. One of your grad students, if I'm not right.
Emily Leichner, now Dr. Leichner.
Dr. Leichner now. She did was it a podcast called?
It was a radio series over 2 years.
Using and refusing museums. And this is Nuxalk Radio. So radio is
and it's available. You can listen to that if you go to Nuxalk Radio 91.1 FM online. You can hear it online live, but you can also listen to those podcasts.
Well, I'm going to put definitely a link onto the transcript of this interview, and just is there anything else you want to say about this future project that you are working on right now? What sort of comes after the exhibition? What do you see? And you did say a snippet earlier that this is really going to be community collaborative as well. So it's not just you; it's going to be many people.
It's really hard to know. I think for me, the next exciting thing would be to see a yak-yank woven by one of these incredible weavers danced during a family potlatch. I'd really like to see the Staldan Talio Hans's yak-yank brought out during Hazel Hans's memorial, maybe next summer before it goes back to Alberta. Or maybe a copy will be made, which is what they're talking about. A new one, not a copy, sort of the new version of it. I mean, every single recreation is a future thinking, and it's that connection to one's ancestors, but also to the future that is so exciting. It's so alive and always new.
And this title, Relations and Returns, Reconnecting Nuxalk Treasures and Kin, that's sort of your working project title.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's the physical belonging, the physical treasure that might go home, that has work to do there. But sometimes that treasure needs to be for the public to see, like your earthquake mask at the Audain Museum, and it can do better work public-facing. And sometimes it's more just about understanding the knowledge of how that treasure was made or why it was made, and then repurposing it for new things. Yeah. But it's exciting. I don't know.
This is exciting, and it just shows that one exhibition can do so much, I think. It's a testament to the work that you do, and this is why I've had a curatorial series on the Blue Hour here, because I want to bring out sort of behind the scenes. Sometimes when the public views an exhibition, they don't actually realize what actually goes behind for many years, and it's hard work, a lot of toil. And so thank you for that. And I would imagine the archive is still on the MOA website for people to look at, or there's
it's
links,
under past exhibits.
Exactly. Okay. Which
and
I can
there's
link as
also
well.
a podcast, because we had a community university what was it, a QUS grant from UBC, Community University Engagement Sustain Grant, that was part of that exhibit, and we spoke about it, Clyde, Emily, and I, just last fall.
Wonderful.
So you can find that here.
Okay, so I've been speaking with Dr. Jennifer Kramer, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia and Curator of the Pacific Northwest Collections at UBC's Museum of Anthropology. here on the Blue Hour. And this is live on CITR 101.9 FM. If you would like to hear this conversation, today's episode will be available through CITR on CITR.ca, as well as now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And a full transcript of today's interview, along with links to the exhibition we spoke about and many of the publications we discussed, will be available on my blog at thehourisblue.com. I am Farah Guerrero. Thank you so much for listening to the Blue Hour today. And thank you, Jennifer, for taking time out of your day to come here.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right. Okay. Until next time, take good care.